Hello, my name is Ilya Ziblat. I'm a composer and an improviser based in The Hague, and I have a PhD from Leiden University in artistic research. The focus of this presentation is my live electronics work Slil. During the last 2 years, I've played this work on several occasions, each time in a different setting, either as a computer music solo performance, or as an interaction between live electronics and other instruments, or sometimes also as a collaboration with live video art. Slil was also released as a studio album featuring 3 duets of electronics and string instruments. In the following presentation, I would like to first explain about the live electronic system I developed. Then I would like to address several ideas that relate to this kind of work: free improvisation and composition, the idea of live electronics musical instrument, and what it implies about technology in a more general, not only musical context. Finally, I'd like to discuss the concept of the musical work and the work in movement. The idea behind this presentation is to establish a paradigm of an integrated musical practice, one which takes into account different aesthetic standpoints and regard them as complementary and interdependent on one another, other than exclusive or contradictory. But first, I would like to start with a short excerpt of Slil, a solo video version for live electronics. Thank you for listening. At this point, I would like to take a brief look on the computer interface I was using. It is programmed in the language and audio synthesis platform Super Collider, and I'm using a touch-sensitive MIDI device in order to control the processing in real time. Before starting to play, a sound file and audio file has to be loaded into the computer, and this sample will later be processed in real time during the performance. This sound file can contain whatever material, like a recording of a guitar or a clarinet or voice speaking, or a combination of several sounds mixed together, as you could probably notice in the video we just heard. After the sample is loaded, the program divides the entire file into 16 segments. During the performance, I control the processing of each segment separately by playing on each one of the 16 touch-sensitive pads of my controller. The interface gives me the possibility to manipulate the original material in various ways. I can move through it in different directions, forward or backward. I can control the playing speed, so how fast the playhead, so to speak, moves through the sample. I can slice it and choose to continuously loop through that beat, or I can even freeze at one particular moment by keeping my finger at one spot, in which case the computer will continuously play one instance of the entire file. I can also control the density of the output by pressing harder or softer on the pads, or by pressing several pads at the same time, so combining sounds processed from several segments simultaneously. Coming back to the title of this work, slil means a reel in Hebrew, like a tape reel or a film roll. And indeed, what the live electronic system does is allowing me to play with the original sound file as if I was manually manipulating tape reel. Loading into the system recordings of musicians playing their instruments or voices speaking allows me to revisit these pre-recorded moments and invites a real-time deconstruction of the original material. There are infinite possibilities, and while playing, the sonic potential of the original material is continuously unfolding, and new sounds and new structures are created on the spot. Based on this description of the electronic system, slil can be best thought of as a musical instrument for free improvisation. There can be, of course, many definitions for free improvisation, but for this presentation I would like to focus on a very general notion that regards free improvisation as a musical structure which is created in real time during the performance as a result of the interaction between musicians and their instruments. What does it mean to design an instrument for free improvisation? To quote musician and researcher James Undin, "The design of such instruments requires to imagine the potential needs of a future performance situation beforehand." This is problematic in free improvisation. Firstly, because the chances are significant that the performance will travel in directions that were not or maybe could not have been foreseen or imagined beforehand. Indeed, the better the improvisation, the greater the chances that this will occur. What I have found out during several trials and experiments I conducted with my interface is that the way in which the program allows me to process an audio sample in real time feels relatively free. It opens indeterminate musical paths rather than making any designated trails or prescribing a fixed set of musical instructions. Even though the program is loaded with preloaded sample, a fact which we might say limit musical possibilities, the experience while performing slil is that of free exploration, shaping a musical path in real time. The fact that my actions are based on a certain fixed, pre-recorded material does not restrict the improvisation, but rather the opposite. It demands for me to remain inventive and to continuously create new sounds and remain attentive to emergent situations. During the design process, or we might also call it the composition process, I imagined and experimented with different ways in which my finger movement could be translated into sound by mapping the data received from the touch-sensitive controller onto audio processing parameters, sound parameters. How to couple the movement of the fingers on the sliders up, down, left, right, harder or softer, with sound parameters, louder or quieter, shorter or longer. How to create an instrument with a gratifying sense of tactility that could translate physical gestures into agile sound processing and that would engage my attention as a performer also during repeated interactions. All these questions point towards one single principle. It is the capacity of the interface to allow improvisation and to open up paths of experimentation and exploration that make it effective in the real-time musical situation. Describing slil as a live electronics instrument requires us to think a bit farther on technology in a more general context. At this point, I would like to bring into the discussion a few ideas by philosopher and sociologist Bruno Latour. For Latour, technology is not an instrumental concept. It does not exclusively serve a designated and predefined aim, so to speak, means to an end, but instead, technology opens up new paths and unanticipated experiences. Technology, instead of having a functional utility, has never ceased to introduce a history of unfoldings, detours, drifts, openings, and translations that abolish the idea of function as much as that of neutrality. Latour describes the way in which an instrument can open up a new path for its user. With an instrument in hand, the possibilities are endless, providing whoever holds it with schemes of action that do not precede the moment it is grasped. An instrument offers its user the possibility of exploring heterogeneous universes that nothing up to this point could have foreseen, and behind which trail new functions. Latour's notion of technology suggests an indeterminate path, unknown results, unforeseen implications, a view which very much agrees with the idea of SLIL as an instrument for free improvisation. Openness rather than direct instrumentality is the objective of the design process of such an interface. Latour goes further and suggests a link between technology and morality. The unforeseen detours and experiences which a certain technological tool initiates affects its user. It leads them in certain directions, even if those were not planned or expected in advance. In this sense, the tool changes the behavior of its user. Using a tool to complete a task imposes a certain way one has to conduct themselves, and Latour compares that with our relationship with our moral codes. The moral law is in our hearts, but it is also in our apparatuses. To the superego of tradition, we may well add the underego of technologies in order to account for the correctness, the trustworthiness, the continuity of our actions. In this sense, the way in which SLIL's interface does not only allow me to create sounds, but also provoke me to explore the inner foldings and hidden details of the original sampled material, provides a certain modus operandi or musical behavior which could be best described in terms of improvisation, and in this sense, improvisation can perhaps be thought of not only as a musical practice, but understood more universally as a moral action, a way of interaction with others and with the world. One viewpoint which explicitly connects between improvisation and morality is that of composer, performer, and scholar George Lewis. Lewis suggests that the study of musical improvisation might nonetheless offer the possibilities of using music itself as a critical tool to re-theorize political, historical, and social issues, as well as carrying out comparative analysis of the dynamics of social and political systems. The musical freedom that my interface creates, or in fact demands, implies of course that each performance carries distinct result, different sounds, different improvisational paths, and emergent interactions with other musicians playing different instruments. Why then am I choosing to describe this array of potential renditions as a single work, bearing a single title SLIL? I might as well have chosen to describe all the different performances as separate works, or as independent improvisations. In order to answer this question, I would like to bring into the discussion the book The Imaginary Museum of Musical Works by philosopher Lydia Gore. In her book, Gore discusses the emergence of the work concept in Western art music from a philosophical and historical point of view. Gore asserts that it has become extraordinarily difficult for us nowadays to think about music, especially so-called classical music, in terms other than those associated with the work concept. However, for most of its history, the tradition of serious music was not thought about in these terms. Speaking about music in terms of works is neither an obvious nor a necessary mode of speech, despite the lack of ability we presently seem to have to speak about music in any other way. It is perhaps true to say that the work concept, in relation to an interactive, collaborative, and improvisatory process of musicking, as the one I've described here, is redundant and perhaps even misleading. At the same time, I would not like to ignore the tension, a positive tension as such, between the drive to create a musical structure that stands out as a complete entity, a concluded, a finished work, and between the improvisatory, real-time, free exploration which takes place during the performance, and the way this freedom is even further elaborated during recurring performances with new ideas and new sounds. The gap between the thread of distinctively different performances and renditions of Slil and the single work concept could be bridged by introducing another idea, coined by Umberto Eco in his book The Open Work. This is the work in movement. Eco writes about the work in movement. Works of this kind characteristically consist of unplanned or physically incomplete structural units. In other words, the author of a work in movement offers the interpreter, the performer, a work to be completed. This idea is further explored by Swedish musician and scholar Henrik Frisk. To Frisk, a work in movement is a radically open work that involves collaboration, negotiation and interaction between various participants, namely composer and performer, as well as the partly giving up the traditional view on our respective roles. In Frisk's working process, the work continues to readapt and change through a musical dialogue that moves back and forth between designing or composing musical structure and performing them. What is the relation between Slil and the work in movement concept? In my case, being both the composer and the performer, the aim is not to prescribe any structure, but to initiate real-time structuring. The adaptations I was making in the system between one performance and the next, and the unforeseenness of the result, allowed me to adapt to different situations, playing with different musicians or perhaps solo version, so to a certain sense, that was a practical consideration. However, I was also interested in creating a diverse as possible array of sounds and structures, so that each performance results in new material, new sounds, as fresh, so to speak, as possible. At the same time, I cannot ignore that the initial conditions or musical resources tie together all the performances under a single surname, as a single improvisatory work. This is a notion of a musical work which is alive and apt to changes, readaptations, and new realizations. The work in movement in this case is a work which is about real-time structuring, a tool for free improvisation, and a live electronic instrument that calls for the exploration of given material and for the creation of new processed sounds. By choosing to describe Slil as a tool for free improvisation, as much as a musical work and a work in movement, I have attempted to suggest a new musical paradigm that integrates all these ideas into one single creative practice. My practice as a composer, improviser, and computer musician does not understand these activities as inclusive paths. Instead, I am interested how these combine together into a single musical result. I think it is totally realistic and even necessary to consider our musical and creative paradigms, because the borders between different practices or roles are many times way more blurry than we think. One example of a musician who explicitly suggests such integrated creative paradigm is electronic music composer Nick Collins, who is also active as a software developer and as a live coding performer. Collins' homepage is named composerprogrammer.com, which can give us some clue about how he regards his own practice. Another example is that of composer and performer Jennifer Walsh, who, in her New Disciplines Manifesto, describes her own practice as rooted in the physical, theatrical and visual, as well as musical. I believe that as musicians we have centuries-long experience in learning and mastering new tools. Not only technological instruments, but also traditional musical instruments or notation techniques. And we know how to assimilate these in our creative practices as extensions of our bodies and of our imagination. Finally, I think we also understand very well how these tools affect us in return, as Latour suggests, and thus, why it is important to update our creative paradigms, and by that to challenge our current musical as much as social, political, and cultural systems. Thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and questions.